Welcome back to another video. So today we are going to be taking a look at a debate which I didn't think we'd be taking a look at. So there was a debate between Matt Dillahunty, who is a famous atheist and debater, and a guy called Matthew Adelstein, or Adelstein, hopefully I'm saying his name right, who also goes by the name Bentham's Bulldog. Now, both of these guys have actually commented on antinatalism in the past, and they've both been against it, and I will try and find all their stuff and link it below. But they were actually having a debate about whether it's reasonable to believe in God, and the topic of antinatalism actually came up several times. Now, before we get into the bits of the conversation which are directly about antinatalism, I'm going to play a clip which precedes those bits but adds a bit of context for the rest of the discussion. I'm not going to be commenting on it, but I'm just including it so that you get a fuller picture of what they're talking about. So let's get into it.
In my opening statement, I described a view called the self-indication assumption, which is the view according to which your existence is more probable given a theory on which there are more people that presently exist.
Yep.
Do you accept the self-indication assumption? And if not, what do you make of the argument I gave for the self-indication assumption?
I think it's the exact same thing phrased a different way, which is it more likely? Is my existence more consistent with a God that created a universe that wanted to result in me? Yes. But my existence is not confirmation that that is what actually happened.
Okay, so, and I've given my reply to that, which is I think that your existence is likelier if there's a God that wants to create you than if there's not. But it's not.
This is irrelevant.
It's not
okay. This isn't just. This is 20 back and forth. That is not all just you asking me questions. I have questions to ask you as well. But go ahead.
I was finished. I finished before you said your thing. Sorry. Go ahead. Ask a question if you'd like.
Why is it good to create life?
Well, I think the reason to create life, the reason why that's good, is that it's good when people exist, when they have happiness over the course of their life. One of the most widely agreed upon views among philosophers about what things are good is that, happiness is a good thing. And so if there's a being who can bring about very large amounts of happiness, and they have no constraints on how much of it they can do, and they're morally perfect, then it's likely that they would bring it about, or at least not very unlikely. And I think anyone who's not an antinatalist should accept this. They should accept it's good to create people.
So to respond to what Matthew is saying here, he's essentially saying that creating life is good because it also creates happiness, and increasing the amount of happiness in the universe is a good thing. Now, Matthew's worldview might just be so different from mine, and I'm sure many of the people watching, that they may not be reconcilable, but there's a few things to say here in disagreement to the assumptions I think he's operating under. So the first is that it's confusing to me to see happiness in this way, in that happiness is this good in and of itself that we should just try and increase in the universe regardless of whether it's good for someone. So in my eyes, obviously bringing happiness to people is a good thing, but only if they exist to need or desire or be benefited by that happiness. Existing people have an interest in being happy, and if they aren't happy, then presumably they are maybe going to drift towards ill-being or sadness or boredom. So happiness seems to provide a very tangible benefit to these people, but creating people in order to create happiness as if these people are just vessels for some sort of experience that you value seems bizarre to me. Another thing I want to say on this is that, of course, if God created life because it's good to create life that will experience happiness, look at the life that has been created. It is pretty clear that there is a preponderance of suffering and harm rather than happiness and meaning and well-being, or however you want to put it. Now, I've made a video previously on why our lives are actually much worse than we tend to think, but there are also some additional things that we can say on top of this. So even if someone thinks that it is good to create life because it brings happiness, you've got to understand that that happiness also comes tied to suffering. And I'm not sure if Matthew would agree with this, but in my eyes, we have a stronger reason to avoid imposing suffering on someone than we do trying to benefit them in some way. Even if you think it's good to bring happiness into the world by creating new sentient beings, we've got to look at the actual state of the world and realize there's just so much more suffering in it than happiness. And so simply as a matter of practicality, this just doesn't seem to go through. Of course, we can talk about hypothetical worlds where people come into existence and just experience bliss or have overall blissful lives with some amount of suffering that's, not significant in comparison, but look at the world we're actually in. So those are a few things to say on what Matthew said, which may not necessarily change his fundamental view, but it might add a few things that need to be taken taken into consideration when you're making statements like this.
The problem is that you're just brushing off antinatalism and then scooping everything in with antinatalism. So if there's, God doesn't, in your model, does God just create happiness?
God creates people who he gives good lives to, and I think these lives are particularly good when you take into account.
What about the people who don't have good lives? What about the people who don't have good lives?
There are any people who will ultimately not have good lives, because I think God will ensure an infinitely good afterlife for everyone. I think that's what would be required.
So your solution to the problem with reality is to posit an extended reality for which you don't have evidence, and that's where the good comes.
No, I don't not have evidence for it. We have evidence in the form of evidence for the existence of God, and if there's a perfect God, and it's good to give people an infinitely good reality, well, then God would be expected to do that. Sorry, I mean, do you agree that if there were a perfect God, it would be likely to give people an infinitely good total existence? Because that's a good thing to do.
So I'm not going to get into a detailed argument about whether there's a God that exists and whether it's reasonable to believe in them or whether that God is perfect. I would just say that those are very philosophically controversial views, and to support something like creating beings into a world where we see so much suffering by appealing to an afterlife which we're promised is going to be infinitely blissful just seems fanciful to me. Of course, more detailed argumentation would be needed on that topic, but this is not the place for it here. This is a video about antinatalism rather than whether a God exists or it's reasonable to believe in an afterlife. My view is that I don't think we do have good reasons to believe in these things, but just be very wary of people that are willing to impose serious harms on people, which it seems like Matthew is, because he supports creating people.
So I don't think there are any people who will ultimately not have good lives, because I think God will ensure an infinitely good afterlife.
Sorry to take you away from the video. So this is Lawrence in the edit, and I just realized something. I'm not sure if I'm taking things too far. Maybe I'm reading things into Matthew's argument that I shouldn't be. He explicitly says that he thinks that all lives are ultimately good because there's this afterlife that has eternal bliss and stuff like this. So he would presumably think that all lives are worth starting, right? Worth creating. Even the very worst ones in this life, right, which I would just generally consider the very worst lives. But obviously for him, it would be the very worst life in this life, and then there would be an afterlife. That still seems to me like he would then support actively bringing beings into existence that would be tortured in this life, because they would then get the guarantee of an afterlife of endless bliss. Now, I'm not sure if this is something which he would agree with, but if he thinks that the more happiness the better, then bringing more lives into existence the better, even if those lives contain immense torture. That was just something I wanted to insert there. I didn't know if it is something he would necessarily accept is entailed by the belief he has, but it was just something that occurred to me, so I thought I'd just put it in there so that people can at least consider it when they're watching this video and taking everything in. Anyway, back to the video. And seems to support the general project that God has been engaged in creating life, and look how that's gone. Again, I'm not saying Matthew would obviously agree with every single thing that has happened in the history of the universe when it comes to sentient life, but if you're generally going to appeal to a God being perfect, and this is what God has done, there's some sort of tacit endorsement buried in there of what has happened throughout the history of life.
First of all, you're just asserting that it's good. You're not demonstrating it's good. And second of all, you're basically saying you know what a perfect being would do. I don't. How do you know that a perfect being wouldn't conclude that humans, that imperfect beings, that creating imperfect beings is ultimately a mistake? Because a perfect being has nothing to learn from us, has nothing to benefit from us, is not missing anything. Otherwise, they would be imperfect. So why would a perfect being create anything?
So I think this is a valid point from Matt, and the only thing I would add on top of it is just if you're interested, like Matthew, in having infinite bliss in the universe and in just increasing happiness to an untold extent, then surely if there's a perfect God, God can just do that in and of himself without creating the suffering that came with it. So it just seems that it can't be reconciled that we live in a world with so much suffering, and yet there's a perfect God that created that. Like Matt said, why would God have needed to create us, these imperfect beings that live in flesh suits that malfunction all the time, why would he need to have created those to then instill some happiness in, and then create loads of those in this sloppy and callous way where each of them suffer, many to extreme degrees, but at least we're increasing the overall happiness in the universe, when surely God could have just increased the happiness in himself to an infinite degree without all of this suffering in humanity, let alone non-human animals. This just seems absurd to me, but it's fine because there's going to be an infinite afterlife where you'll have bliss, so it's okay.
So the reason a perfect being would create anything is that, as I was saying before, it's good for a person to exist and live a happy life, and it's good to do that even if you don't learn things from the people that you create.
Good for who?
Again, Matthew is just repeating himself here over and over again, kind of like a stuck record of like, it's just good to create people, right? It's like, why? And why were humans deemed as the best vessel for that, right? Like, even if it's good to just create as much happiness in the universe as possible, why would it be created through humans? Surely there could have been like simpler beings where they can't have the capacity to suffer. Things are less likely to go wrong because they are just structurally simpler beings. They don't have all these complexities like arteries that can be blocked, or brains that can get dementia, or wrists that can be slit. Why humans? What sort of loving, all-powerful, perfect God would create the world where we are the ones that are supposed to be experiencing this happiness? Surely, like I've said, God already existed, presumably, under this worldview. God could have just increased his own happiness to an infinite amount if that's what someone thinks is the best thing in the world. Why create these billions of years of life and so much suffering in that for the happiness that God could have just had himself?
I think we have a difference in how I think we have a difference in how we go about doing moral epistemology. So my view is,
I'm not doing moral epistemology. I'm not even evaluating this on moral. You say it's good for people to exist. It may be good for some people to exist, but is it good for God for people to exist?
Well, if God is morally perfect, then it's not a question of whether it's good for God. It's a question of whether it's good, full stop, for people to exist.
No. There's no such thing as good, full stop. It's good for some.
Why do you think that? Why do you think there are no such thing as good, full stop? Like, for example, I think the Holocaust was bad, okay? It was bad, full stop, It wasn't just bad for the people it affected. It was bad. The world is a worse place as a result of it happening.
So we should probably stop using language like full stop because we're talking about two completely different things there. When you say it is good for people to exist, is it good for insects that people exist?
Well, that's a funny example to bring up. I've written a lot about human impact on insects, but I actually think yes, but I grant there are certain creatures for which our existence is not good, like factory farm animals.
I wasn't making any conclusion because I can see a case where our existence is good for insects and some insects, and our existence is bad for others, especially as we use pesticides to kill some of them off and mess with the ecosystem, and ultimately we may be wiping ourselves out in that case. But your basic claim here is that a perfect being would create people because it's good for people to exist, but it's not good for that being to exist. So what's the motivation for a perfect God to create imperfect beings? It doesn't benefit God.
Right. So the motivation is, as I described, I think some things are just good, full stop. I think if there was just like huge amounts of torture on Mars, where just like everyone on Mars was suffering, there were large numbers of people suffering on Mars, I wouldn't just say that's bad for the creatures on Mars. I'd say that that's bad, full stop.
So this would probably require a wider moral discussion to fully disentangle, but I just want to put a note here of, I'm not understanding exactly where Matthew is smuggling this extra bad in when these hypothetical beings that are all suffering on Mars, of course that is bad for each of those individual Martians, but where is this additional bad coming from when if you get the sum total of the badness of the suffering is bad for all these individual beings, you put that all together and this is how bad it is that suffering is taking place. Where is this additional badness coming from that we're lumping on top, and how much is that? This just seems confusing to me. It seems like this badness is being conjured up out of thin air, maybe just because Matthew doesn't like it. I mean, if he doesn't like something and that's causing him to experience negative emotions, obviously that's an additional bad, but that's not conjured up of thin air. That's him experiencing it, right? So I'm just not sure where this additional bad is coming in that he's kind of just asserting as a way to help his argument here. The question of antinatalism then comes up again in the question and answer session, which I will include a few clips on, but I'm not going to include any commentary because I didn't feel like anything that was brought up was sufficiently different from what has already been spoken about for me to make a comment on. I'm just going to include them now so that anyone interested in this debate can see the relevant segments.
Why is creating life assumed to be good? Can't life be created to create suffering? Further, how does this argument circumvent the Euthyphro dilemma?
So the Euthyphro dilemma is not a problem because I'm not claiming that morality comes from God, and it's only a problem if you think that, which I don't. Regarding why it's good to create, so remember, for the argument to work, you don't have to think at the outset that it's very likely that it's good to create. All you need to think is that it's like not totally ridiculous that it's good to create, because the odds, even if you think the odds like starting out are like 1% or something, it's still way higher than the astronomically low odds on atheism. Now that said, okay, why is it good to create? Well, it's good to create because it's good to exist, to live a happy life. Just like it's bad to exist if your life is just full of misery, it's good to exist if you live a good life. And I think for this reason, we should expect God to guarantee everyone to have an infinitely good afterlife. Once you think that's the situation for everyone who comes to exist, which I think is very likely conditional on theism, then it looks like it's very likely that God would guarantee to create. Regarding antinatalism, there are lots of antinatalist arguments. I can't go into them in any detail. If you want to see more, I have a philosophy paper called The Sequence Argument Against Procreation Asymmetry, where I argue that it's good to create in more detail. So you can check that out if you want to hear more of my answer.
If I deal out 4 hands and you end up with all 13 spades, you have the perfect bridge hand. That is incredibly unlikely, and yet it has happened multiple times because there's 13 factorial different combinations of that as well. But it's incredibly unlikely. And it just looks significant. They're all the same color. We've got one of each number. Just like when you get 4 kings or whatever, all of those seem significant because they're significant to us. And we seem to be the significant focal point of the universe because we're significant to us. And so this is all about, a perfect God would make people because it's good to make people. Well, I'm not convinced it's good to make people for anybody other than the people and other than some people. How do we know that there's not a God who is intentionally making some people more miserable than others, who is allowing us to fight instead of solving stuff, how do we tell the difference between a universe that is created by a God with the intent of producing us versus a universe created by a God with the intent of producing black holes, and we just happen to be a side effect, versus a universe that was not intended by any God, but as the product of natural processes, and that we are the result. If you don't have a way to distinguish between those, it's meaningless to say this universe is more likely if we are the intended product of a God. You're correct. And then the response should be, so what? Until you demonstrate why it's the right answer, I should not accept it.
Now, Matt asks, why would God make a life? He could make so many things that doesn't benefit him. The answer is because it's good to create life. It's good to exist and live, It's good for me that my parents created me, that I get to exist, that I get to be happy in the world.
So that was everything to do with antinatalism from the debate between Matt Dillahunty and Matthew Adelstein. Let me know what you think of their arguments. Let me know what you think of my response to their arguments, and I'll see you in the next one.
Oh, Lord. Oh, you are so big. So absolutely huge. So absolutely huge.